I knew I was going on after Ben, and I knew he'd tell you a lot of things very, very quickly. So I'm just going to tell you one thing very slowly and repeatedly. It's the Oxford way. We will get it in. No, we vary in Oxford. We're both from there. Right. And it's in the title. Because I was asked if I'd speak here, I think in February or March of this year, and I was very angry. I was angry because I thought something had happened and it was getting very little reporting, which at the time was that deaths in England and Wales had risen by 5% and in Scotland by a massive 9%. That's just the absolute number of deaths. But hardly any epidemiologists were looking at this or commented on it. It's about a dozen, I think, who have looked at it now, about less than a dozen. Half of them are in this room. RCTs, statins, all the rest of it, antidepressants, of course, matter. But if people are dying in greater numbers than before, I would have thought it should be looked at. And what I'm interested in is whether did this event, which I will describe to you, occur at the wrong time, just at a time when epidemiology has moved on to exciting things, complicated methods, and really social issues, and this kind of, retrospective observational study looking at past prevalence is kind of old school, or am I making a mistake and a few people are interested in this, and is it actually not that important? If it is important, does it tell us something about epidemiology? Now, the exciting thing, the reason why there are a few more slides, maybe not that exciting, is it's not 5%. That's what I knew when I wrote the title. It's possibly 7%, maybe even 9%. Measure it another way, it's 0.06%. Whatever it is, I think it matters because I compare it to other things. By the way, Scotland, they published their life expectancy recently. Nobody bothers looking at these things. It's only life expectancy, the basic, most important social statistic that a country ever produces. Anybody want to tell me what's happened to life expectancy in Scotland in the last year? Hasn't gone down yet, because it's the average over 3 years. For men and women, it's stayed the same as it was in the last 3-year period. Does that matter? It's the first time it's ever happened in 160 years. I kind of think it's telling us something. And once we go through the 3 years, we're going to get life expectancy falls. This could be a very short talk if I don't go forward. There we go. We ignore very bad news. We also ignore remarkable good news. So I just put this up and somebody can tell me later if I'm getting this wrong. I wonder why I don't see commentary saying that within a year or two, the WHO reported infant mortality rate for China is about to do better than the USA. I don't think the figures are fixed. I do think it matters. The other thing, from a very simple measuring point of view, is that the rate at which infant mortality is falling at the moment worldwide is so very fast that we can tell it's the fastest it can ever be, because it can't go to zero in about 15 years' time. Very, very simple maths to say that there's a very interesting story. We don't look at the good news stories, and we don't look at the very bad news stories. We kind of tend to look at the stories where we can show off our ability of how clever we are. And because I'm a geographer, I look at the simple stories rather than to show the ability. But I want to know why, when something finally happens that really matters, don't you kind of put the complicated thing that's going to make your Nobel Peace Prize win to the side for a month. Only every so often when something really bad happens, just put it aside for a month and do something on the important thing and then go back to what else you're doing. This is from the Dallas News. I don't think many epidemiologists read the Dallas News, but it's about doubling of pregnancy-related deaths in Texas. And the reason I'm showing you this is quite recent, is that, and if it's calculated differently as a maternal mortality rate, it still doubles between 210 and 214. It was described as very complex. Researchers were baffled by why it had happened, although they did point out that 82 clinics had been closed and 2/3 of the funding had been closed for women who were pregnant in Texas. But they were baffled by this. And a Department for State Services spokesman told the Houston Chronicle in this case that it was a complex problem, and there is no evidence to conclude that the clinic cuts caused the increase in maternal mortality rates. Now, I can understand why it's really important when somebody wants to suggest that coffee is bad or good for you, that you're sceptical of all those kind of things. But when you have women doing worse in childbirth immediately after you've cut the clinics that are designed for women having babies, to say it's all very complicated and you can't say, I think the onus should be the other way round. It should be you need to say it isn't when it's that obvious. And again, this is against the orthodoxy of everything is unproven till it's proven. But the reason for saying that is that the government's response to the rise in deaths last year in England is it's all very complicated and you can't say. As far as I know, none of the 4 chief medical officers of the UK has yet commented on it. What is the job of a chief medical officer? Well, put it another way, how many people have to die before a chief medical officer decides to mention the fact that more people are dying? Things have changed in Britain. So you can have a former president of the BMA, this is Michael, saying it is government policy to increase inequality and make things harder for families with children, and it doesn't get much reported. Are we entering an era in which we've become hardened? So we've had bad news for quite a few years. Things were a bit tough in Texas. Yes, of course it's going to happen. Maybe that's part of the reason. There is a reason for bringing this up, which I'll get to in about 4 or 5 slides. This is a picture a friend of mine took in the Cotswolds just over a year ago. Not the kind of image you normally see in the Cotswolds. My friend doesn't have UK citizenship, and he was a bit worried when he saw this in the Cotswolds. I wasn't that worried. You used to kind of that's what's happening. Maybe we should have worried, but the point is about what's happened on the day. It's interesting as well, the family just to the left, looking a bit more worried about what they can see. And I also quite like the way the sun shines off his head. But anyway, I wonder how often I can use this picture. Just related, simple observational stuff that might matter. This little graph shows you that since 1991, young people in Britain have stopped voting in important things like general elections or referendum. So just in case any of you are young and feeling a bit put upon, it's been quite a long time since young people have been politically engaged. Simple observations often matter. That's the pattern of who voted which way, and I'm going to relate it to health in a minute, but essentially forget Scotland, which had a different reason, or Northern Ireland. In England and Wales, it was people in areas that were winning that voted Remain much more. And these things could be related. And the problem is, once you say you want to look at the social again, you're into the uncomfortable territory of arm waving, a long, long way away from tests and causality. Let's go off to results because it's depressing. The reason for going on about the referendum is that although I said a 5% rise in England, we found out that the rise was much, much bigger. But the day in which ONS released the data was the 23rd of June at 10 o'clock. And ONS didn't even release a press release with the data because they were not allowed to, because there was purdah by law for the referendum. What the mid-year estimate showed is that 52,400 more people in the UK died in the mid-year to June 2015 than the mid-year to June 2014. The death rates by age rose by 12% for people over 90, 10% 85 to 89, 7% for those 80 to 84, 5% for those 75, that should say 79, 3% for those in their late 50s to early 70s. Actually fell for 25 to 29-year-olds, death rates. 25 to 29-year-olds, by the way, we had 60,000 net immigrants, healthy immigrants from Europe. These are very big rises in death rates in a year. Before 2015, we already knew that life expectancy was falling in some areas. This is showing life expectancy in older ages here, over 65, 75 and 85, falling in between 21% of areas for over 65 to 43% of areas for over 85s by 2014. This is before the big increase in deaths in 2015. There's very little geographical pattern, which isn't very useful if you're a geographer. And we can speculate it's partly, what's interesting about this age group is that by the time you're getting into late 80s and 90s, you're mostly talking about middle-class people who get to live that long. But one reason why there's very little geographical pattern to the increase, it's happened almost everywhere apart from West Oxfordshire, as far as I can see, is that the data is really bad on where old people live now. We have the census, 2011 census, but whatever it was that led to the increase in deaths may also have altered the geography of where old people are. They may not have been getting into care homes in the way that they were in the past, or they may be with relatives. At the extreme, we know that in Rhyl, in Wales, which isn't a particularly rich area, there's only one person recorded as being aged over 90, but think about 47 deaths of the over 90s were recorded in Rhyl. That shows you just how bad your population data is. Rhyl has trailer parks in it. We now have trailer parks again in Britain. Awful graph just to show we're very bad at health spending. You know these things. There's numerous reasons that you can think for why this kind of thing might have happened. A crisis in the health service. Heads of the health service was saying that this was going to occur before it occurred with their little part of the process. That little blue line is showing you the increased deaths over the 5-year average over months. Just to show you that this went on and on and on and on. It wasn't just a very short shock. Because in February, the official line was, it's influenza, and our vaccine didn't work. Influenza looks like that. When you get an influenza epidemic, it looks like that, and if you could read the age groups, you'd see it affects the young in general more than it affects the old. But we also know from the death certificates now that it wasn't mostly influenza. Most important slide. You can go to sleep after this, so I'll wrap up rapidly with just about 5 more slides. If you look at the mid-year to mid-year rise of 9% and compare it to the biggest annual rises in the past since we began collecting these things around about 1840, then by that most dramatic way of measuring the rise, it's a 9% rise, and there are only 6 events which had a bigger rise in the rate of death in 1 year, which was influenza in 1918, war in 1940, cold winter of 1929, the Great Frost of 1895, and 2 cholera years with John Snow doing very well in 1846 and 1849. Now that's the most extreme way you can rank this. But it is quite an important thing. You go all the way back to number 23 in 1968 for the last time you find something slightly comparable. The calculations are there for how you do it. So it is a question. You're epidemiologists. Some things happened. You know, for geographers, if a volcano erupts and a new island's formed, we kind of say something about it even if we don't know anything about volcanoes just because somebody asks us and they're excited. So why is there not interest in what used to interest people so much? At the time, I just finished an atlas of Britain with my colleague Bedford Thomas. We had this set of graphs in it. These are from the BHPS, showing changes in satisfaction with health, and huge drops in satisfaction with health between 2011 and 12 and 13, doubling rises. I sent this to George, which is the kind of thing you do when you really don't know, and he just went, has to be an artifact. Whenever I see anything like that, it's always an artifact, which generally it will be, you know, changing question wording, changing sample. But as yet, I've not managed to find any evidence it is an artifact, so I publish it and say. And given that a few years after the population of Britain started saying that their health was much worse, very large numbers of people died, it could be related. I feel embarrassed saying it. The complicated slide just shows you the latest statistic, which is worse than ever. It matters because this is one of the key components of Cameron's happiness index. The happiness index was announced around about 2010. Nobody's bothered to check it. ONS in the latest one published it in such an obscure part of their website, it's almost impossible to find. It contains a lot of things which are wishy-washy, but a basic question about are you dissatisfied with your health in a government happiness index, and people saying they're less and less satisfied with their health, not because they've aged. Cults actually been getting slightly younger because we had very few births in the 1930s. Should matter, and the last figure is below the confidence bounds, if the confidence bounds mean anything. So people have been telling you they're getting worse, and then they've been dying. It's kind of, what else do they have to do to get your attention? But of course they're old. And maybe that's it. Maybe that's what matters. Here's the absolute rises in deaths by age group. Very smooth, very clear. Here's how you get 0.06. If you look at the absolute increase in deaths in the country, not the change in the death rates, that's when you get a 9% rise. If you look at the absolute change of deaths, it's only the 32 most important effect, because fewer people die now. The big one's still 1918, 1846, they're all 1800s, because it's infectious diseases. Infectious diseases, big rise in deaths, small deaths next year. 1951, 1968, slightly higher. There's all kind of ways you can look at it, but however you look at it, it's the biggest event since 1968. Are we just going to wait? There's the relative rates. It's very smooth, so it suggests it's the frail, it's the elderly who are frail who are dying in higher numbers. People who are near to dying anyway, they've just died a bit earlier. So maybe that's why it isn't important, but I want to know why it isn't. And there you can see the drop in death rates of 25, 29-year-olds, and the big unusual thing about them is they included lots of healthy migrants, and we're going to stop them coming because we don't want healthy 25 to 29-year-olds coming into the country. And it isn't migration in. We've yet to get all those people coming back from Spain who can no longer afford or are allowed to use the Spanish health service. That's all to come. Other reasons, the thick line here shows the cut in public spending in Britain. You may not know this, we're one of the lowest public spenders, lowest taxes in Europe. We've cut more than Greece, but we just do it in a very, very polite way. So cute. But we are still on track for heading down towards US levels of public spending. Positive care law may have broken down. This is people looking after friends and families. We know that petrol consumption dropped to the crash. Who do you not go and visit when you reduce your petrol consumption by 10%, which is what we did on average? Is it your elderly relative? There's all kinds of reasons. Loads of graphics like this. We're heading to be like the USA. Philip Hammond today said the British people are more comfortable thinking they're like the United States than Europe. We are already halfway across the Atlantic. If it's due to the kind of things I think it's due, then we should expect more problems. And if you want a counterfactual, if you take the decline in death rates over the last 40 years, which kind of stopped abruptly around about 2012, and take the decline forward, if that hadn't happened, you end up with 80,000, 90,000 deaths compared to what we should have expected if we hadn't had a stall in our health. Other big changes that are happening, more's happened in the last 5 years of British society than in the previous 25 or 30 in terms of sudden and great transformations. One reason why this news wasn't reported when the data came out on the 23rd of June was, if you can remember, because people were trying to get it in the papers, there was a different news event every single day. Prime Minister resigns, somebody stabs somebody else in the back. I've forgotten, but there was always something that appeared to be more important. This is just showing you that landlords have increased their wealth by 434 billion since 2004. The data comes from the Financial Times, but you're used to it. So you're used to a country in which the very rich are taking over. Let's not show you that. This is the drop in social care, social services, visits to the elderly. Massive drop in numbers of visits to people who are not doing very well and need somebody to make a cup of tea for them for 15 minutes and check they've not fallen to the bottom of the stairs. And lots of cups to come. I'm going to leave all those out and just get to the very end. We either have got used to this, or maybe it's a price worth paying. If somebody's going to be affected by cuts, it turns out it's the people who we thought we were doing good for because we gave them a triple lock on their pension. and we were being nasty to the young because we were giving them student loans. But what use is a triple lock on your pension when your hip goes and you're living in a nice detached house in rural Oxfordshire, but you can no longer actually get down to the bus stop and the rural bus service has been cancelled? I think one thing this is showing us is that the people who most relied on the welfare state and the most affected by the cuts aren't the children who don't go to children's centres anymore, or their parents who don't get the help from the children's centre. People who really rely on the welfare state are the elderly. And the irony of this is it's the most elderly of all, the 85 to 90 to 92, 93-year-olds, who most rely on a functioning welfare state. And to get to that age, on average, you had to be middle class when you were aged 50 or 60. And you can think how you were likely to vote in 1979 and 83 and 87. Anyway, I'll leave that one with you. And you have to get into the politics of this. What is really going on? What does it take to think it doesn't matter that much? It's too late to change anything, you can't alter it. This is actually an estate agent's sign that you see in Oxford now. After they've sold a house, they put up too late to really rub it into the majority of the population who have no chance. And, you know, we're in a society where young people can't start families, where we're worrying about the economy, where we voted Brexit. A few people have been lucky enough to make it to 85, not making it to 88. Scottish life expectancy stalling. Maybe it isn't that important. So it's a genuine question for you to think about. But I suspect it is important, not just for the health outcomes and the health effects it has on people, and the fact that one day, hopefully, not 85, maybe 82. George always looks at my waistband at this point. But yeah, the middle class of UK should really worry about this, because this is what will happen to us if things don't change. But more importantly than that, are there wider effects? When life becomes harder, when the elderly find it harder to actually survive, when their children can't start families, do people's attitudes harden? Remember, it was the elderly who voted to leave far more than the young. And it's also, in terms of health, the elderly who've been reporting to the BHPS that their health's been getting worse, who like the idea of 350 million a year more to the NHS, and who have been dying in record numbers. That's the immigration map. I have to put one map in. If any of you are wondering where all the immigrants are in Europe, they're on the mainland. They're in Switzerland, they're in Spain, that's us. They're in Paris, and in the UK, the healthiest area is London, because it's got lots of healthy migrants in it. And of course, the areas with immigrants, Northern Ireland and London, vote to remain. I won't tell you about that little boy. But I do want you to think about that picture, as that's the Chancellor of my university a few years ago, consoling his daughter when they had to leave Hong Kong. And I do think epidemiologists used to talk about wider connections with things and society and trends and what's going on. And I don't think it is unrelated that the United Kingdom, and especially Scotland, may have just experienced one of the worst health events, at least in Western Europe, when we finally get the data, as Martin said, to be able to compare all the countries. And the indications we have already is that it hasn't been as bad anywhere else. I don't think there's no relationship at all between that and the fact that we have become, apart from Greenland, the first country in the EU to vote to leave. I think there is discontent, and the discontent is related to the fact that people's lives have become materially worse. And if you have a government who tells you this is due to an infectious disease, don't worry, it's a one-off, and you have a whole set of people who know about infectious diseases, you shouldn't be listening to a geographer showing you a histogram of how flu affects people, because there shouldn't be any need for me to do that. Thank you very much.